Hello, everyone. It's Antonette again, Antonette Jefferson. I am now beginning again this week my podcast. There have been several podcasts prior to this point, about 3 podcasts prior to this point. I am the graduate of 6 different universities, whereby 3 of those degrees were in law, a JD, which is a Juris Doctor, and then 2 Master of Laws, one in child advocacy and one in intellectual property. And then I also possess a few other degrees in English, communication, and social work. And then I also am the author of 10 different titles, 10 different books, and several articles. So I have been discussing Charles Hamilton Houston and social engineering in the past few weeks, and I am returning to this text. It's from my book Law, Race, and the Constitution in the Obama Context, and I'm actually sharing from one of the essays in one of the books, and it is entitled African American Attorneys, the Business of Law or the Business of Change. And the subtitle there is Charles Hamilton Houston's Contributions to the American Legal Context and the Reinvention of the Social Engineer in the 21st Century. So this is where we find ourselves in the last few weeks. I discussed basically the introduction. I talked about Frantz Fanon in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, where there is a similarity among black professionals, professionals generally, but black professionals and blacks in the colonial context, whereby the professionals in the U.S. context and the colonial context are kind of rending to fight against the colonial or the context in which they find themselves, in which we find ourselves, to bring about change, or to even just navigate for personal and professional reasons, not just social advocacy reasons, but just in the context of survival and making financial means and gains, and also helping family, helping friends, those things of that nature. So that's the simple analysis of it, but it's very much a complex idea, because that system or that society, which gives a lot of individuals, people, blacks, minorities, specifically blacks, their abilities or practice in this regard, is also the system that has historically been a system that has had certain challenges, whereby black Americans have had to engage in certain acts such as the civil rights movement and movements of that nature in order to bring about change. Now, I'm going to pick up where I left off last week, and I was discussing Charles Hamilton Houston and the social engineer. And the social engineer is essentially the advocate, the lawyer who advocates for social change, and who is a social engineer, engineer of the context of legal things, of social things, of cultural things, of political things, and so I want to pick up here after I have in the past discussed the theoretical context, have discussed the introduction and the background, as lawyers and professionals are the mediators between the general society and also the general environment, and the personal context and the family context, and how the black lawyer navigates these various and different and dynamic situations. So I'm going to pick up here now, and I'm picking up where it says, while scholars no doubt have their particular chosen terminology of the Houstonian approach, there is a generally undisputed agreement that Houston's approach is captured in the term social engineering. A social engineer is defined as a highly skilled, perceptive, sensitive lawyer who understood the Constitution of the United States and knew how to explore its uses in the solving of problems of local communities and in bettering the conditions of the underprivileged citizens. Houston believed that one was either a social engineer or a parasite. Houston also held that African American lawyers were under an obligation and responsibility to advocate on behalf of the masses of African American citizens. In fact, Houston, as a social engineer, and though living a relatively privileged lifestyle, could not be said to be a typical elitist. And the consequence of his birth to middle-class parents in no way prevented him from advocating for the rights of those who were unable to represent themselves. Rather, his role foreshadowed the contemporary role of African Americans as mediators and negotiators, although Houston's role seemed a bit more expansive role, more of an expansive role in terms of overall impact for the masses of African Americans. Now I'm transitioning to the characteristics of the social engineer, past and present. In the past, and as a social engineer, the Houstonian social engineering approach involved litigating with excellence, strategy, and skill to effect essential changes in the jurisprudence of American law and the individual and collective lives of African Americans. I'll say that again. In the past, and as a social engineer, the Houstonian social engineering approach involved litigating with excellence, strategy, and skill to effect essential changes in the jurisprudence of American law and the individual and collective lives of African Americans. McNeil avers that the Houstonian approach of social engineering can be defined in terms of Houston's life approach. She indicates the following as the core principles of the Houstonian approach. 1. Law and constituted authority are supreme only as they cover the most humble and forgotten citizen. 2. Human beings are equally entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, irrespective of differences in race, sex, national origin, or creed. And that in a good society, the government guarantees justice and freedom for everyone while providing more opportunities and freedom for succeeding generations without being hindered by prejudice. Based on these premises, Houston's approach can therefore be said to be humanistic, just, and based on principles of excellence, equality, and fairness. Today's lawyers inevitably borrow from these translatable skills endemic to Houstonian logic, but their utilization of such skills are not necessarily for the sake of grand constitutional issues. In fact, excellence is a prerequisite for the African American attorney who by nature and or conditioning must be a cut above in order to gain acceptance into law school, complete law school, and practice as an attorney. Excellence and high standards are important in the context of the social engineer. Excellence and high standards comprise the habits of African American attorneys who have often worked to attain the level of influence and notoriety that they have claimed. And this excellence is demonstrated in the day-to-day work of African American attorneys. It is demonstrated in private and public agencies, in government, in media, and in overall politics, not just in oral argument before the Supreme Court. While definitions of excellence vary, it is fair to say that societal perceptions of attorneys, generally to include African American attorneys, is that they have attained a level of education and competence that renders them capable and qualified to handle often complex matters requiring solid reason, logic, and analysis. Further, W.E.B. Du Bois' theory of the African American attorney still rings true in the 21st century. In his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois highlights the fact that African Americans provide the moral fabric of American life. As such, ideas of fairness and justice are instilled in African American attorneys who often are only removed a single generation, if that, from a staunch religious background. Further, the African American is often encouraged to be the moral consciousness of society, and this role has been fashioned for the African American since the inception of America. Whether laudable or detestable, the socialization of the African American renders him an agent of morality, and his role in society has been and continues to be to balance the scales of justice. Although this balance may be in the form of massaging feelings and creating feelings of justice and equity, Such a role cannot be downplayed, for it is what the masses feel that creates peace in a society. Ideas of equity, equality, and the guarantee of rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are central to the consciousness of social engineering African American attorneys. Not only do they consider themselves equals in society, but many African American attorneys generally believe that such guarantees should be realized by the black community. Work done by such lawyers as Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, and other civil rights lawyers reinforces the idea that African American attorneys believe that the American dream is possible and deserved for black constituents. Thus, when selecting those who will enter the inner circles, morality, at least in terms of allegiance to legal professionalism and observance of social mores, is important for those lawyers who are to gain admittance. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, African American attorneys, including Patricia Roberts Harris, Kwesi Mfume, Charles Rangel, and Eleanor Holmes Norton, have utilized the general principles and strategies, legacies of Houstonian techniques, including advocacy and representation. Moreover, such attorneys as Johnny Cochran worked to assist African American defendants in his practice and have worked to defend African Americans in his practice by representing them in disputes. However, similar to the same limitations of mass advocacy, there are limitations to the role of legal representation or legal representative as a tactic of social engineering. The African American attorney can attempt to manipulate the courtroom through strategies or antics and can advocate for judicial activism, but the African American attorney must do so in the courtroom or the media or through other authorized spaces in society. And the end result of client representation may affect social consciousness in that there is a win for the black race, an overwhelming feeling of justice after the acquittal of O.J. Simpson, but there's been no real change in terms of economic and political power in the lives of the everyday masses. In addition to limits on effectiveness of individual representation, the lack of significant media attention given to constitutional issues regarding African Americans has created less opportunity for African American attorneys to impact change at a national level. Beyond police brutality, such as in the case of Abner Louima, Rodney King, and other victims of African descent, the most controversial and racially charged event of recent has been the election of Barack Obama to the presidency. President Obama's election created a dialogue around race and race issues, and it can be argued that he changed the power dynamic through his election. However, we can see that he changed the power dynamic through his election. However, when considering the political machine and the nuances of Washington, it can also be argued that Barack Obama is merely an attorney who maintains the status quo and whose changes are not necessarily characterized by social engineering in the general sense, but social engineering in the political sense. He is changing the American context, but not as a social engineer of African American life. Rather, he is engineering change for the United States as a Harvard-educated and legally trained American president. Social engineering is thus given new definition in the 21st century. The social engineer is now the public interest lawyer, the elected official, the firm associate who engages in pro bono work. The social engineer does not work for integration and enfranchisement. Rather, he works to create a comfortable lifestyle for himself and his family, to become influential in society, and to mediate or negotiate between the masses and the elite through individual and micro associations. The 21st century social engineer is not distinct from any other type of attorney, yet by virtue of his race, he is connected to the masses, and his consciousness is shaded by bourgeois reality or aspirations. He is trained in the king's language and thinks like the practicing intellectual. He is not working to change the court system, but is an example of success and accomplishment. He uses his networks to find jobs for promising law students. She uses her influence to create careers in political administrations for her colleagues. The social engineer of today is a lawyer who understands how to create situations and opportunities for herself and for those and for those who have demonstrated that they can handle the rigor of professional life. So I'll end here, and next week I'll pick up with existing roles of African American attorneys. So this has been the podcast, the fourth podcast in a series of podcasts about the social engineer and the role of the African American professional and the role of the African American attorney. So thank you, and tune in next time. This has been Antonette.